Hi, I'm Lily, and I'm doing a report on anthropological reflections on missiological issues. It's a big name for a book, a lot of big words. But it was written by Paul Hybart, and I'm just going to go ahead and get into what it was really about. Um, I enjoyed reading this book, but it was very heady. It had a lot of terminology used in it that was not necessarily always explained, which is all right. It just took a little bit longer that way. Um, Hybert's thesis for this book is essentially to show how anthropology is interrelated with missions, with theology, and with history and with philosophy. So he kind of starts out by taking this view about the history of philosophy, the history of thought. And he does this to kind of just establish how anthropology is going to eventually be related to the history of thought, and specifically thought about religion and science and how they're interrelated and how we can know anything about reality, really. So he begins by talking about several different philosophies that have been very prominent throughout history, and then he kind of narrows down, focuses in on three main ones that I would say are held by most people now, or most people throughout history. And so the first one that he talks about is idealism, whether that's just absolute idealism or critical idealism. He talks about this idea of kind of reality is what you think it is, and then you manifest that reality into the real world. So everything tangible is kind of illusory, or it is, you can't know anything certain about it. The only things you can know are in your mind. Like I said, again, very philosophical, heady kind of type thing. So then he moves into naive realism. And this is kind of the absolute opposite end of the spectrum, where he explains it as a snapshot of reality is what science is. So it's kind of this argument, surely you've heard it before, that science encompasses everything in the real world, and you can learn everything you ever need to know about the world from science. However, there's been a lot of research and evidence that this is not true. There's a lot of concepts that we can't use the scientific method to prove, which I think a lot of people get caught up in the wording behind what exactly science means, and they miss that science is what we can prove and see. There's a ton of theories that we can't. And so this kind of leads into his philosophy that he argues is the most correct, which is critical realism. And so he takes this stance that critical realism is this idea that the world is knowable and science is good. It's just a guideline or a map to what is knowable, but in no way does it encompass everything that is knowable about the earth and about creation and the supernatural. And so he takes this stance because he thinks it best encompasses reality, and it fits well with religion. The other two either would say all religions are true, because idealism kind of says everything you believe in your mind is reality. So every religion's true, and every religion will lead you to ultimate understanding. And naive realism would kind of say the opposite and say no religions are really true if they believe in anything supernatural, because science can only prove the natural and it cannot prove anything supernatural. So he says that critical realism is the way to go. And so after he kind of does this history of thought, he gets into a little bit more about why this matters and how it's impacted actual history. And so he focuses a lot on Western Christians and their missiology and stuff like that. And so he begins at the colonial era, and he's kind of going through from colonization until now, how these ideas on the philosophies of reality transfer over to social science and how we view others, is what he calls them, foreign peoples or different cultures that we're not familiar with. So he first goes into the colonial era, and he talks about missiology at the time because of the anthropology and philosophy at the time. People just really thought that there was like a range of people from barbarians to Westerners, and Westerners had the ultimate advancements and everything, and so all cultures would end up at the place that Westerners were industrial-wise and philosophically. So through colonization, they were just helping other people get there a little faster. I would say we could all see the flaw in this line of thinking, and Hibbert was definitely not promoting it, just explaining that the theology at the time was filled with Western culture. And so whenever missionaries were going to places that they were colonizing, they spread a lot of Western culture in Christianity, and they kind of preached the gospel in a way that included more aspects of Western culture than the gospel itself has in it, if that makes sense. So this idea just came from the philosophy that we knew what was best, and we were the ultimate advancement in thought at the time. But then after that came an era called anti-colonial, and an anti-colonial era, this is the people that were all about contextualization. So they saw the error in their ways of just spreading Western culture mixed so heavily into Christianity that it was getting rejected because of the Western aspects instead of being rejected for Jesus' name's sake. And so they were big champions of contextualization, which we've talked about a lot in class. And so it was interesting to see Hibbert actually presents that there are two ways to do contextualization. So that in the anti-colonial era, they were just like contextualization, 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 but in a way that promoted everything good about a different culture, but it didn't condemn anything that was wrong with other cultures' practices. And so we can easily see where that could cause a big problem for Christianity. We've had a lot of discussion board talks about what parts of culture are amoral, immoral, or moral, and which are biblical, unbiblical, and which are kind of neutral. And so by not condemning some of the practices that were immoral, they didn't do a service to the gospel. So then after that comes the era that we would now call the global era, and that's what we'd say we're in right now. But this transition to the global era was not all good. It did not push everybody in the right direction. Some people really rejected this transition into the global era, Hibbert writes about, and they went back to a neo-colonial way of thought, where they were back to pushing Western colonization type culture onto other cultures while they're sharing the gospel, because they saw that contextualizing in a way that promoted everything about the culture was not successful. But we'd say, on the other hand of that, most people in the global era now look at contextualization as a way to encourage different aspects of culture that are positive and moral and neutral, but also challenge those aspects that are immoral, that do not coincide with the gospel. And in that way, we're able to help the cultures that we're doing mission work and sharing the gospel with, to kind of take their own sense of ownership of the gospel. And so they're creating their own theology, and they're creating their own cultural practices without misconstruing the gospel. And so obviously one of his main points is something that we've talked about a lot in class about how there's so many difficulties in just taking the gospel and stripping away our Western beliefs and biases and just stuff that we believe and put on because that's what we're used to, stripping that back to just the gospel and then introducing the gospel into a culture and laying in their culture so that they can understand it as well. And so it's obviously a twofold process. And if we only do one of them, like if we only include attributes of the culture that it's getting presented in, it's still going to be mixed with Western culture, and it still might seem very unattractive to the people because of the Western influence. But if we just strip back our Western biases and don't include aspects of their culture and try to just preach the gospel bare without any culture in it, it's pretty much impossible. And so there's just a lot going on there, and that's pretty much the summary of the book. He spends 3 parts in this book, and I kind of only told you about the first part, but the second 2 parts are just bunches and bunches of chapters on examples of actually putting into practice these ideas and philosophies on missions and why it's so important. A lot of things we've already talked about, cultural aspects that you might not consider without also considering anthropology or the culture that the gospel is getting preached into. And so I also wanted to say, though, I don't have 100% positive reviews about this book. There were a couple things in here I did not agree with. Hibbert does claim very early on he's Anabaptist, and so he has a whole chapter on there on how Anabaptists specifically combated some of these missiological problems. But I wouldn't say I agreed with everything that he said. Obviously, we're working in a Southern Baptist context here at Southern Seminary, and so people have a little bit of different views on things depending on their denomination. But also, he took on kind of a weird stance on there being a bound or not definition of a Christian. And so he was talking about an Indian that he met, kind of a hypothetical Indian that heard about the gospel but only once, and he was illiterate and he would never hear about it again, and he believed at the time, would we still say he's a Christian? So he kind of went into a bunch of different stuff about, well, in Western culture we really bind our definitions, and we say they're very intrinsic and they are what they are because of what they are. And so if we wanted to say that about a Christian, we would have to define different beliefs that they would have to have and different qualities they would have to have. Whereas if in other cultures they're a lot more extrinsic and a lot less bound with their definitions, and so things are what they are in relation to other things. And so he kind of argued that a Christian is more a progress. It's not necessarily exactly a decision that it transforms you from not a Christian to a Christian. And there's no way we as humans could really determine what exactly makes a Christian. I don't think I would agree with that. I think that there's specific things in the Bible that say how we can know if someone's a Christian or not and what beliefs are absolutely essential for that. And so ultimately, I would recommend this book to you guys to read. Again, Anthropological Reflections on Missiological Issues. Very heady, but it'll give a lot more background into what we've been talking about in class. In class, we've talked about a lot of cool stories and applications, and this is kind of more of the history and the philosophy behind it. So if that's your thing, I would definitely recommend this book to you guys.